If you are here in Vietnam right now, you will see the amount of vehicle and traffic has reduced a lot because the oil and gas prices have been increased. Someday it has spiked to like 50%. So one of the highest price increase in the Southeast Asia region. Right now it's about 30% higher than before the Iran conflict.
A friend of mine who is a historian based in Beijing, and he ran a simulation with a few AI tools. He appointed like 3 AI tools to be negotiators for Israel, US, and Iran. You can see that, at least from a simulation point of view, the US was much more pressurized to end this war, whilst I think Israel wanted to accelerate this, and while Iran is taking a long-term view, saying it's already very painful, and just like what people said about China last year, right? They can tolerate pain much better than the US.
What is the impact of short versus long, right? Obviously, they short, then everything goes back, everybody's happy. But in a longer term scenario, what does a longer term scenario look like? And what are some of the second and third order impacts?
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey Jianggan, hey Valerie, so excited to have you. This is actually our first ever 3-person podcast on Brave, so this is exciting. And we thought that this was an excellent time for us to talk because there are so many listener questions about the impact of the current energy crisis and its impact on Southeast Asia and outlook. So you're an expert on China and Southeast Asia, and Valerie, you're an expert on Vietnam and Southeast Asia. So I think this is a fantastic opportunity to discuss. So I think, first of all, obviously we know the facts, people can Google themselves about what the energy crisis is, but I'm just kind of curious, like, what is the energy crisis being portrayed in your own countries, right? In China, Vietnam, how is it being reported in the news in terms of the dynamics?
Sure, I can just describe quickly what is happening on the street in Vietnam right now. Honestly, you can see the amount of cars and bike on the street right now has reduced by at least 30 to 40% because the oil and gas prices have been increased like by someday it has spiked to like 50%. So one of the highest price increase in the region, in the Southeast Asia region. Right now it's about 30% higher than before the Iran conflict, but it's still like very substantial price hike, which, take a toll on regular daily life of all of us Vietnamese. So yeah, the government and some of the big companies even say like they encourage like working from home to the employees. So if you are here in Vietnam right now, you will see the amount of vehicle and traffic has reduced a lot. So that's the actual like reality in the day-to-day in Vietnam right now.
I actually just came back to Singapore from Shanghai like 2 days ago. I'm going there again on Friday. So I've been observing about how people have been talking about this, how people have been observing about that. I see there's a more enthusiasm about how can Iran like go up against the US, that kind of narrative being spread across, especially the social media space. In the public media, of course, they are all controlled by the government. So the narrative is, I think first, so there will be a shock. And the second, I think oil supply is very diversified nowadays. We see the effort of the Chinese government trying to diversify the oil supply over the last 2 or 3 decades. And the third, there are plans for external shocks. So in a way, that's to instill the confidence. And I don't see much impact to people's lives as of yet, because, we're still in the early days, right? So there's a bit of an increase in prices of petrol, but we don't know how this will go, whether the war will be over soon and things will go back to normal, or the oil price will shot up another 50% and it will create lasting impact. We don't know yet. There's interestingly another narrative, almost kind of laughing at places where, not really in the traditional media, but in social media, laughing at places where things become too reliant on a particular source of supply of energy, like liquefied natural gas for Taiwan, right? Because I think they decommissioned the nuclear energy and relied a lot on LNG import. But overall, I think things are kind of calm. And I think this is something that people are watching from afar rather than what happened last year with the tariff war, where I think many businesses were impacted, that people are talking much more proactively last year.
Yeah, and I think in Singapore, it's, quite calm, right? Because I think Singapore actually is quite diversified in terms of energy mix. So obviously, it receives oil from many places, around the world, not just through the Straits, and that's one. And then two, obviously, it does actually have oil pipeline that runs through Malaysia, and so there's also diversification. So I think Singapore, it's not going through an energy crisis, and it's also, I think, wealthy enough and has enough savings to go through this. But it does, of course, have a drag because Singapore is actually a huge petrochemicals hub, right? So if you don't have oil and gas, then you can't refine that into different products and so on and so forth. So there is actually still a knock-on effect on the economy, actually. And I think the government has started to warn about that. I think another aspect that's there is actually about logistics. So the Singapore port is very busy right now because all the ships are being diverted, has to go through Singapore. So there's actually a lot more traffic at the port level in terms of business and logistics. So I think it's a mixed picture for Singapore, but it's not as a direct impact as well compared to Vietnam. Yeah.
I think in early days, because I think some of the shock waves would take a while to reflect. If it becomes lasting, right? I mean, I've been observing the stock market. It went down for a couple of days, then they rebounded. It seems that people are not pricing in that this will become a long-term impact yet.
Yeah, I think we should talk about that, right? Which is, what is the impact of short versus long, right? Obviously, if it's short, then everything goes back, everybody's happy. But in a longer term scenario, what does a longer term scenario look like? And what are some of the second and third order impacts, right? So maybe I'll start first. I think it can be quite long, actually. I mean, we obviously don't know, but, there are multiple players to this dynamic. And maybe it's 3 months, maybe 6 months, maybe it's 1 year, but definitely it could go longer than 1 week, right? So I think that's something that I'm still processing personally. Jianggan, what do you think?
A friend of mine who is a historian based in Beijing, and he ran a simulation with a few AI tools. So basically, he appointed like 3 AI tools to be negotiators for Israel, US, and Iran, and he ran a large simulation, and it became very interesting that you can see that at least from a simulation point of view, the US was much more pressurized to end this war, whilst I think Israel wanted to accelerate this, and while Iran is taking a long-term view, saying it's already very painful, and just like what people said about China last year, right? They can tolerate pain much better than the US, and they don't have to worry about votes and stuff, so they can last as long as they can, and I think the pressure is on the other side. So I don't know what's the scenario where all parties can claim victory and all parties can basically have their concern addressed to end this conflict. 4 years ago, when the war between Russia and Ukraine started, I think there were negotiations, people saying that, okay, let's end it. But in a situation where nobody can claim victory and it just dragged on. And I remember I was talking to Dimitri back then, right? And he was saying that, bear in mind, this war can last for a very long time. And now it's like 4 years on and we don't have an end in sight. So going back to the Middle East, I think the US, because of the way the politics are set up, there's midterms coming up and stuff. So probably they need a solution very quickly. But the other parties, I don't know. I mean, I think this might last for a very long time. Maybe low intensity, but it might last for a long time. And if that scenario happens, how would the supply chain, how would the business dealings, how would oil be sort of redirected? I tend to be a little bit optimistic to still think that, okay, there's some resilience there.
Yeah, I think that I remember at the start of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, I got to hear a speech by former Foreign Minister George Yeo, right, for Singapore. And one of his predictions was that, this could be a very long conflict, right? And I think at the time, nobody really believed him. I mean, everybody was kind of like skeptical because, it felt like, I think people haven't grown up with war for a long time, right? And he was very much saying like, hey, this could drag on for as long as like the North and South Korea conflict in terms of like still being unresolved at some level, right?
Yeah.
It could be a cold or frozen conflict for a while. Valerie, how about you?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you guys are so calm because everything feels a bit like chaotic and fearful here in Vietnam. Like the day that the news broke out, like our stock market lost 12%
Oh,
in
wow.
1 day. Like the drawdown is crazy and it's mostly coming from foreign investors. But still, like there's a lot of shock still in the country because we are an energy deficit country. So we import like 90% from one single country, Kuwait. And we do have our own domestic refinery, but we rely so much on Kuwait. And geopolitically, we are in such a difficult position. So January, we finished our like one of the most important election for the next, like I would say 10 years for Vietnam. So General Secretary Tholam was re-elected. And his first foreign visit was to US because President Donald Trump hosted Border Peace and he joined the trip, and the US removed us from export control country. So now we are able to like import very important semiconductors pieces or like some aerospace material and other like potentially weapons from US. So that just happened in like mid-February. And then early March, the news broke down, and our big cousin China is right like next to us, and they are actually visiting Vietnam right now. So, February we visited US, March Chinese government is visiting Vietnam. And at the same time, we have, I would say, more friendly relationship with Iran, given in the past history when Vietnam was in kind of in the late 70s and early 80s. We have a lot of trade embargo with the rest of the world. Iran was the only country that support Vietnam and send us oil and never ask for repayment. So I would say we don't express like a strong opinion against the war, but we are friendly with Iran. So actually our government have shipped some rice and some other like food to Iran. So we do have a friendly relationship. So we are actually a very extremely like difficult position geopolitically wise, even though we are a very classic like bamboo diplomacy strategy. I don't know how much longer we can use the same bamboo strategy like in the future if the conflict arises and get more intense. Do we have to pick a side, and how are we diversifying our energy supplies? That's the biggest like math question right now for everyone in the government right now. Fortunately, a lot of manufacturing in Vietnam, we still rely a lot on like hydro and coal power. So like 40% coming from coal and then following by hydro. So if you are manufacturing in like electronic and food processing, the factories are still running fine. But for like textile and garment industry, you have a lot of raw material that depend on oil and gas. So those are being heavily impacted. So we cannot afford to have this war last for longer. Yeah, we are not as calm as Singapore or China's seem.
Yeah, I think one thing I was surprised by actually how diversified the energy for China has become actually, right? A friend of mine was saying like, oh, like the Straits of Hormuz is 50% of Chinese oil and gas imports. But one thing I didn't realize until quite recently was that if you zoom out actually, for China, coal is 60% of electricity, oil and gas is 30%, and renewables and nuclear is about 10%, right? And China can choose to burn a lot more coal, right? So this energy crisis for the rest of the world actually is only 50% of the 30%, right? I.e. 15% of China's energy mix. So it's actually solvable, and you have plenty of coal, plenty of renewables from the solar cell industry. So I think it's quite interesting to actually learn about that now. It's actually quite surprised, actually.
I think it takes a few decades to build that kind of diversity. And I think even to this day, I think the government is still not entirely satisfied. They're still looking for ways to keep diversifying that, because I think strategically they know that, okay, if the dependence is on a single strait, I mean, whether it's Hormuz, whether it's Malacca, it's dangerous. So my great uncle used to be the president of the University of Petroleum in China. I remember like back in 1990s when I was a small kid, and he was going to places like newly independent Kazakhstan and would bring back like, nice Kazakh coins and stuff. And I was asking, would you like keep going to these like, places? And he said, there's a big strategy to diversify the oil supply. And in return, I think the government in China would help those countries like build their infrastructure, train their engineers. So of course, him being a president of a university focused on the petroleum sector, he's there is to say that, okay, we're investing in oil infrastructure, but we also bring the training facilities here so that you can train your own petroleum engineers. So that was like 1990s, and it took a long time. I also remember when people first started talking about wind energy, right? And there's lots of talk about it being so expensive, etc., etc. You have to buy all the turbines from Germany, etc. But I think 1 or 2 decades into this inroad, first, I think a lot of things can be produced domestically once you create sort of enough density that they can lower the costs. And second, every time I fly out of Beijing, and if the flight turns north to the mountains, I always do like to take a window seat to see old wind turbines they have built in Inner Mongolia. I've seen lots of wind turbines in many places, even in the sea and stuff, but that scale of hundreds of turbines across the mountains in a very windy area, I think it showed some commitment because this investment takes a longer time, and initially it definitely loses lots of money, and it probably takes, I don't know, a decade or more to recoup some of the investment. But I think when you have the ability to plan and execute for long term, you can achieve something.
So let's look at this from the industry prism, and then later on we'll talk about the backcountry in Southeast Asia. So let's look at the industry prism first. One industry you mentioned, Jianggan, is up for sure. I think we're looking at renewables and electric vehicles. I think are up. Obviously, China's push on solar cells, for example, as well as EVs is paying fruit. And I think many countries across Southeast Asia are going to accelerate their usage of solar cells, as well as electric vehicles to get more energy sovereignty, right? And I think they'd be happy to buy or import that as needed. Any other thoughts about industries, like up or down or mixed pictures from both of you? Yeah.
I think still going back to the energy sector, we had a very large family reunion, and because of my great uncle, there are lots of family members in the petrol industry across the world. Some of them are in North America, some of them are in the Middle East. I have a cousin who has been living in Kuwait for like 10 years. As Valerie said, where lots of the energy of Vietnam is from. I actually discussed with them about potential flashpoints of things. And generally, they are much calmer than I am in terms of the shock to the energy, because they said, okay, there are lots of things which could be done. But the thing is that when the oil is cheap, or when the oil from a certain like major producing regions where extraction is cheap, so then there's no incentive for others to do other things. But as oil price goes up, a lot of investment into the alternative sources would actually be accelerated. I got that feeling when I was in Germany, actually in February, and I actually visited one of the top engineering universities there and was discussing with the friends there, and they were saying that you see there's lots of talk about alternative energy sources in Europe, and Europe is regulation heavy, and lots of things were not moving. But towards the end of last year, you see a lot of planned projects suddenly started moving very fast. That coincided with the time when Trump was saying that, okay, they need to take Greenland. So that threat got lots of people together saying that, okay, we've been discussing about this for 15 years, pros and cons and stuff, but now let's do something about it. So cascade that down to other industries. I do think there's a lot of resilience across multiple sectors. And also we are in an era where I think with the tariffs last year, etc., so there has been a lot of shock which has been absorbed into the ecosystem, and people are less likely to be caught entirely off guard. Because, I mean, even if you, from a material point of view, you are not prepared, you're not fully prepared, but from a psychological point of view, you are less caught off guard about certain things.
I was going to say this will affect every single industry in Vietnam because it's impacted, transportation, logistic, cost of goods sold, raw materials. The price of oil and gas has already impacted the increase of every food costs. And I think inflation we already feel inflation. So I think inflation might get to 4 to 5%, and I think it's already at 4%. The government just doesn't want to admit things are a bit in shock. But if you go to supermarket, yeah, everything, especially food costs and for restaurant, cost of goods sold has already increased. So this event is impacting every single industry in Vietnam, and there's no winner here, including the renewable and EV industry. You still have to move things. You still need energy to produce batteries, etc. So I don't see a single winner for Vietnam as a whole right now. Everyone is suffering. Yeah.
I'm actually surprised that this effect is felt so fast. Because
Yeah.
I mean, the few places I've been to, it seems that okay, people are anticipating certain some uncertainty with energy prices, but the impact is not immediately felt yet. So, what is the structural point about Vietnam that made it sort of fast, the shots?
I think because fundamentally we are an energy deficit country, as I mentioned, and oil reserve can only last us for up to 20 days.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 20 days. And yeah, I think the GDP growth target, I think is very hard to achieve up to 8%. Realistically, right now, I think the target should be just 6% if the war continue longer. And also because we are too relying on one country for oil. Yeah, we don't have a lot of initiative on diversifying energy sources like China did.
So I think what's interesting is that, this actually talks about some of the second order and third order impacts, right? I think first order impact obviously is, electricity, right? So obviously coal is up, renewables and EVs are up. Actually, nuclear is going up as well. So, Singapore signed a civilian nuclear research treaty, right, with the US several years ago. Indonesia has flagged that they're interested in exploring nuclear as well. So I think there's going to be renewed interest on the nuclear side. Obviously, everybody's much more appreciative of oil and gas now, right? Malaysia and Brunei are both oil and gas exporters as well, right? And Indonesia also does produce oil and gas as well. So obviously, I think that's the first order impact on across energy. I think Valerie is actually talking about a very important second order impact across Southeast Asia, right? Which is that, for example, oil and gas becomes fertilizer, right? Through processing, and then fertilizer becomes, food, right? Whether it's rice or cash crops. So there's actually a huge second order impact on fertilizer prices, and then third order impact on food prices, right? So that's one aspect. But also, I think it's fair to say that transportation costs actually are increasing as well. I mean, even in Southeast Asia, Grab has already flagged that they are starting to take action because obviously, they pay riders, right, motorcycles and cars. And if a driver's oil and gas bill doubles, then what's the value proposition for them to keep driving for Grab, right, or Gojek? And so the leadership teams have already flagged that there's some things they can do, obviously, but that raises the cost of transportation, not just for people going to the office, but also for logistics and trucking, right? And I think the last impact, actually, I think Valerie needs to point out well, actually, is really about countries that have a manufacturing and export strategy, right? Because as long as the cost of energy goes up, the factories does need, they can't just use coal, right? It's not just electricity, right? They do have inputs like sulfur and all these other byproducts from oil and gas, right? Or you just need gas, right? So if you're versus, I think, countries that are more services oriented, then they can afford to use electricity that's produced by different sources as well.
So I think downstream, right, because oil is a global commodity that impacts the prices of everything. And if the price remain elevated and the factory input is high, electricity cost is high, that would eventually translate down into inflation in the importing countries like the US, right? And consumers, I mean, if nothing is done, consumers will feel the pain. And that will bring us to, 2023, where like inflation was the top talked about the topic. And it might have helped Trump win the election in 2024, right?
Yeah, I think it's tricky, right? I mean, America does have quite a substantial oil and gas industry, right? Actually, domestically still. So to some extent, the pain that they face is quite different from, say, Japan and Korea, right? Which, don't have a domestic oil and gas industry, right? And so I think that's quite a tricky position. Yeah.
They do have huge shale oil industry, and I remember my discussions with the family on energy, and there was lots of discussion about what would incentivize people in the US to actually extract shale at large scale. So obviously the oil price, one of them. But again, at the end of the day, this is the global commodity, right? I mean, many countries which are oil producing, if they keep the energy prices artificially low, and they need to subsidize because that's lost revenue for oil companies, which could have sold this at higher price globally. But the problem is that once you start a cycle of subsidies, once you start that cycle of, I don't know, I think it's complicated. I don't know the full impact. I think lots of economists are probably thinking about that. We've run some simple discussions with different kinds of AI and lots of analysis coming up. But at the end of the day, I mean, how exactly this will go, what are the detailed scenarios, and what are the knock-on effects that are not captured in all the training data for AI. So this is tricky.
Yeah.
So
I think what's
boom.
interesting is let's talk about the country level, right? Which is, there are countries that, for example, do subsidies in Southeast Asia. So let's start first maybe with Malaysia, and then we'll go through all the other countries. But I think for Malaysia, obviously, they are net exporter of oil and gas, right? Especially with Petronas, right? So with those prices going up, they are starting to sell and get more revenue, and that's one. But of course, they do also have a fuel subsidy to their domestic consumers as well, right? Which you just mentioned. I think some similarities to Brunei as well. So Brunei, of course, is the other big oil and gas exporter in Southeast Asia. So I'm sure everyone's very happy to be friendly with the Brunei folks as well. These two countries are the exporters of oil and gas in the region. Yeah.
I think for Brunei, it's only 400,000 people, right? So even if you subsidize the energy for people's daily consumption, it will not cost much. Malaysia, on the other hand, is more than 30 million people. And of course, for you to subsidize, the cost is much higher. I think without going too much into politics, but I think, the government in Malaysia has been talking about increasing adoption of EV. And there have been plans made. I drive to Malaysia quite a bit from Singapore. So on the street, you start to see more EVs coming up, but the speed of adoption is nowhere near what you see in China, right? So I don't know if external oil shock can be leveraged by the leaders of the country to actually find a way to do things which would otherwise be very hard to do. Just like what we just discussed about Europe, right? I mean, lots of things were discussed, and then people have these concerns, that concerns, but we have external shock. And if you leverage it correctly, that actually led some policies to be accelerated with minimal sort of objection.
What I would say as well is like looking at the other countries very quickly is that, what Valerie has shared, obviously, as a sentiment is actually shared by other countries in the region, right? So I think Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines are actually much more similar to Vietnam in the sense of they have a lot of domestic energy requirements, a big reliance on oil and gas from the Middle East. And they also have an issue in terms of their food prices, fertilizers, and then also they have manufacturing, right, which is quite oil and gas dependent as well. So I think there's some similar feedback from the ground that these countries actually all have a lot of similarities to the Vietnam domestic issues regarding oil and gas.
Yeah, maybe I would say Thailand and Philippines might be impacted even more than Vietnam because they don't have coal and hydropower as much as Vietnam does. So they might be even more like relying on one single energy source.
I just checked why Vietnam is so dependent on Kuwait for oil. I checked with 3 different AI, so I got a fairly balanced, non-hallucinating assessment. So basically, the 2 largest refineries in Vietnam are designed to be suitable for oil from
Yeah.
Kuwait.
Yep. Only,
It's
I
what
think so. Yeah.
Yongquat and Nissan.
Yeah, Nissan and Zhongguo.
Yeah. So they're heavily dependent on that particular sort of oil type from Kuwait. And the Kuwait Petroleum International is actually a major shareholder of these refineries. So that caused some structural issues, which in a normal time would be fine, but in terms of prices, with certain parts, it's just too much dependency on a single source.
I think another way that the other countries are getting impacted, of course, is, oil and gas impacts fuel costs, and fuel costs impacts planes, right? Flights, right? And as, prices rise, then obviously airfares rise, etc. So I think tourism will take a hit. I think come as a third order effect soon. It distracts on. And so because tickets can rise by 10, 20, 30%, right? And so countries that are more reliant on tourism industries could be impacted as well.
Thailand, in a way.
So I think that's Thailand, yeah.
Yeah, Thailand, because it's especially the low-cost travel, right? I think high-end business travel will
Mm.
still go on, like Singapore. But I mean, Singapore will still be impacted, obviously, because Singapore is such a huge chunk of the GDP comes from the airport.
I think last year and a half, lots of sort of outbound tourism from China to Southeast Asia actually diverted from Thailand to Vietnam for reasons of certain movies and certain sort of incidents with some famous people being abducted and smuggled into Myanmar via Thailand. And although these are like small isolated cases, but that damages the confidence that Thailand is a safe place to travel to. I think the government in Thailand is trying a lot to try to rebuild that confidence. But what we see is that over the last 2 years, I think a lot of sort of outbound travel into Southeast Asia were diverted. And actually, in fact, 2 days ago when I was flying out of Shanghai, when I was going through immigration, and there's a lady on the next counter, and she's holding Chinese passport. She's never traveled outside China before. And she said she's going to Southeast Asia for a job in manicure. And the immigration agent in Shanghai was very suspicious. And he asked her, like, I don't know, like, dozens of questions saying that, okay, are you sure that you are voluntary? Are you sure this is a good job? Are you sure? I mean, so I think they become super alert about all the scams and stuff. But I think for tourism per se, again, it goes back to resilience, right? And so whatever reduction you have nowadays, it will not be as bad as COVID, where you just couldn't travel. So if some people who in the industry who have gone through COVID and they realize that, okay, there could be extreme events happening. I mean, travel and downstream sort of industries like retail, etc. Right? So if they have made contingency plans and they are more likely to ride it out, right? I think the worst would be people who said, okay, I've gone through the worst and let's hope that everything is going well and I'm not prepared for another disruption. Those players might be impacted harder.
Oh, yeah. Vietnam is definitely getting squeezed on all directions. But as a country, we always survive crisis and we always get through the most difficult times. One of my portfolio companies have like pivoted from B2C to more B2B. And instead of serving like smaller groups in the restaurant, like B2C, now they pivot to like big events, corporate event, B2B, because for them, one event catering can equal to like the whole month for restaurants. And the funny thing, the first client that booked event for this month is a petroleum company in Vietnam. And they spend like quite heavy on that event. So yeah, petroleum company in Vietnam, like they're very healthy, very strong. But yeah, to your point about a lot of Chinese tourists have changed to Vietnam instead of going to Thailand, that also helped a lot to Vietnam economy last year, because if you look at domestic consumption growth, it only grow about 5%. So it's quite a weak consumption growth. But overall, our consumption economy still grow, and that's a lot because of the rise and increase of Chinese tourist arrivals. And yeah, they do spend a lot here in Vietnam, and there are a lot of new Chinese restaurants are open in Vietnam.
I think one other aspect about this is about wealth movements as well. If you actually look about 1 to 2 months ago, The Economist was reporting about how many family offices were moving from Singapore to Dubai because of Singapore's like strict banking regulations on like KYC and compliance. But of course, Reuters, I think, recently reported that is the other direction now. So capital is slowly starting to move from Dubai to Singapore because of looking for Singapore stability, right, and safety as well. So I think that's quite an interesting aspect about it as well.
I think everybody makes a decision that is rational, and some people look at more short term, some people look at more long term, and based on their own calculations. So when drastic change happens, do you actually make a move like very quickly, or you just decide to ride out? I mean, we can see all the analysis, all the potential scenarios, but at the end of the day, it's all these sort of individual decisions of business owners or wealth or whatever that cascade into a big wave that either sort of causes the whole ecosystem to be extremely resilient and ride out a challenge very well, or it could be an extreme case where people lose confidence and that causes some political change that gets the world into more instability. So at this juncture, I look at this energy crisis. The reason why I take a more optimistic eye is that I discussed with quite a few friends about what happened in 1973 and 1979, where people were caught off guard, where energy sources were very singular. So now I think looking at the large major economies, energy is more diversified. I think, Valerie, what we mentioned about Vietnam, I'm sure the policymakers have that in mind, right? But it just takes time to build that up. Yeah.
Yes, of course. I wish they start earlier, but yeah, they are on it.
Yeah. And I mean, Vietnam and Indonesia have a lot of coal, right? So maybe another thing I would say is probably air pollution is probably going to go up. That's another industry is going to go up because we got to burn more coal in the region. Yeah.
That's why the air quality in Ho Chi Minh City right now is unhealthy, like highest unhealthy level for the past few days. Yeah, you have to see here in Vietnam. Yeah.
It's probably only going to get worse, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, usually the air quality in Ho Chi Minh City is pretty good, usually like moderate to unhealthy for sensitive people. But the past few days has been like extremely unhealthy. Like it can match level of like Hanoi City, which Hanoi is like very notorious. Yeah.
Yeah, winter a few times the air is really bad.
It's bad. It's notorious. It's probably worse than like Beijing and Shanghai right now.
I go to Shanghai almost every month for the last year, and compared to like 6-7 years ago before COVID, the air quality has improved a lot. I think Beijing is better as well. Yeah. The question is that, do you see this period of growth where, I mean, you have all the side effects as necessary, or do you see it as something which need to be avoided? And don't judge no right and wrong, but I think different people will feel differently. Some people will benefit from all this pollution. Some people will be harmed by that. Yeah, it's hard to look at it from a psychological point of view, but from policy making point of view, I think this is something that they have to consider lots of factors to be able to find a balanced compromise. I mean, it's hard to find something which is benefiting everyone without harming anyone.
Yeah, the only people who benefit from more pollution will be the people who manufacture masks, right, and for air filtration. On that note, I think that's time, and good to hang out with all of you, and hopefully the energy crisis resolves sooner rather than later, and that everybody is able to diversify and work together to reduce the impact on our society, right, from food prices to inflation to manufacturing to jobs. So on that note, this is a good time to wrap the episode.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.